All right, now I want you to delete all the files inside of the source folder. You're going to write everything from scratch. So let's start by adding a new file here. Call it index.js. Here we need to import a couple of objects from React modules. So if you're not familiar with ES6 modules, don't worry, just code along with me. We'll get to them in the next section. So import React from React. So this is the module, and this is the object that we're importing from that module. The other object we need to import is React.dom, and we're going to import this from React-dom. Now let's define an element. So const element. Const is a new feature in modern JavaScript. Previously we used only var, but now we have const and let. Again, in the next section, I'm going to give you a quick overview of all these new features. So let's define a constant element and set it to a JSX expression. So h1, hello world, and close h1. Now, as I told you before, Babel will compile this down to a call to React.createElement. And this is the reason why we have to import React on the top, even though we're not going to directly use this object in our code. But when our code is compiled, because there is a reference to React, that's why we have to import it on the top. Now, let's log this element on the console. So here's one thing you need to know about projects that are created with Create React App. Whenever you save the changes, this application is automatically restarted. So you don't have to go back in the browser and refresh it. This is what we call hot module reloading. So save the changes. Now back in the browser, you can see I didn't refresh the page, and that black banner that we had on the top is now gone. Now open up the console. You can do that using Alt, Command, and I on Mac, or Alt, Control, I on Windows. If that shortcut doesn't work for you, go to the View menu on the top, Developer, and Developer Tools. So here on the console tab, you can see we have an object. This is the output of a JSX expression. This is a React element. So you can see the type of this element, the type property is set to h1, and we have a bunch of other properties here. So earlier at the beginning of the course, I talked about virtual DOM, which is a lightweight in-memory representation of the UI. It's not the real browser DOM, it's the virtual DOM. And this object you see here, this React element, is part of that virtual DOM. So whenever the state of this object changes, React will get a new React element. Then React will compare this element with the previous one. It will figure out what is changed, and then it will reach out to the real DOM and update it accordingly. Okay, so here we have a JSX expression. The result of that is a React element, which is part of the virtual DOM. Now we want to render this inside of the real DOM, and that's why we have to import React DOM on the top. So here we call React DOM dot render. As the first argument, we pass the element we want to render. So here's our element object. As a second argument, we need to specify where in the real DOM we want to render this. So temporarily, let's go back to the public folder. Here in index.html, earlier I talked about this div with the ID root. I told you that this is the container for our React application. So back to index.js, we need to use plain vanilla JavaScript to get a reference to that DOM element. So we call document.getElement by ID. And here we pass the ID that is root. So this React DOM will get a reference to this and render this React element inside of that element. Save the changes. Back in the browser, you can see our hello world message. Let's right click this and inspect it in Chrome Developer Tools. Here we can see our div with the ID root, and inside of this div we have our React element h1 with the tags hello world. Now this is a very simple application. In a real world application, Instead of rendering a simple element in the DOM, we'll render our app component. This app component is the root component for our application. It includes children like navigation bar, sidebar, profile, and whatnot. So we'll have a tree of components which will eventually produce a complex markup.